Hello, my name is Catherine Costo, and I'm the Executive Director of the Albany County Historical Association. Welcome to the second in our series, Extraordinary Art, Scenes of Everyday Life in Albany. Today's topic is In Memoriam, Emotion and Embroidery in the Early Republic. So today we're going to start with embroidery. And here before us is an example of a form that's common and pretty familiar to most of us, the beloved sampler. And they're still being made today, of course. Here's a very typical example from 1832 made by Mary Stevens. It's in our museum collections here at the Tenbrook Mansion. Sampler is actually the earliest that we know of in North America. Came over in about 1620 to 1630. It was made around 1610. And the maker of it brought it over because she wanted an example of how to do open work and white work. But this sampler is a more typical example that you can see. You have the outside border, and it is decorative, but it's a great pattern that can be adapted for so many reasons. So sampler is just that. It's a work sample. And carpenters and woodworkers made similar examples. They might have a joinery box showing different forms of joinery on each corner. So other crafts forms also had the idea of a sampler. So this outside border could be adapted for cuffs, collars, perhaps a baby's cap. The next area of interest, of course, is the alphabet and numbers. And these are very important because they were used to initial and number linens. Textiles could often be one of the most expensive parts of a household. So sheets were numbered with an initial, towels, linens, napkins, things like that. Another part of the sampler is this text area right here, and they're pretty familiar to us. They're often biblical texts. They could be rhyming. They're a reflection on the fleeting nature of life, or in this case, the youth of the young woman who created it, my infant hand. So they often emphasize the difference between youth and old age, the idea of looking ahead and planning for a long life. And then the final part of a sampler, which is really kind of a very enjoyable part right here, is you can see the boat on the river. There's sort of a landscape. It's somewhat abstracted, trees in the house, figures, and the ubiquitous fruit bowl or flower bowl. And these could combine to create a landscape, or those elements could be used individually, perhaps to decorate something small in later years. But what we're going to look at today is a very different form of embroidery. This is a mourning picture, and it was created somewhat earlier than the sampler that I showed you. It's from about 1810 to 1820. And tradition holds it was made by Janette van Ree, who eventually married Jacob Cornelius Schimmerhorn. The Schimmerhorns lived in both southern Rensselaer and southern Albany County. So they're back and forth across the river. And you can see the initials here on the plinth of this obelisk, which is a form we'll talk about. And it could be the initials of one person, or it could be a group of family members. Janette and Jacob Cornelius don't match up with these particular initials, but we're still doing more research to see what the connection is between them. If we look at the elements of this mourning picture, you see the weeping willow, a sign of mourning. There's the obelisk, which is borrowed from Egyptian culture. The landscape, there's the basket of flowers, like you'd see in the other samplers, and the church. And we're going to ask, how did this curious image arise, so different than the long tradition of samplers that we are more familiar with? Well, let's look at the context of what was going on in North America at the time. First of all, the landscape was becoming very classical, and we really associate classical architecture with government buildings. The United States was becoming very classical in its decoration, particularly state buildings. This is a building by Philip Hooker, who happens to also be the same architect who did the Ten Broeck Mansion, most likely. And we actually have the capital of one of these columns right here at the Ten Broeck Mansion. So the idea of a classical world, as you can see reflected in this painting or this embroidery, is becoming more and more important. And there's another change that's going on in the early United States. It's the death of George Washington. George Washington died December 14th, 1799. And we sometimes forget how very shortly that was after he ended his term as president. That ended in 1797. So the country was in great sorrow. And you can see this symbol here of liberty mourning. This image is called the Apotheosis of George Washington. Here's George Washington drawn on the famous Gilbert Stuart painting of him. He's being led up into the heavens by an angel. But here is liberty with the liberty cap in mourning. And you can see some of the similarities to the figure here with the bowed head, the way the hands are arranged. Also, there's a lot of images of George Washington, and again, here's the obelisk, that are proliferating in the United States. This is printed fabric made in England in 1785. So just 2 years after the Revolutionary War, the English have lost their colonies, but you know what? It's a great opportunity to make some money. So English manufacturers started printing this textile. And here's another example of it. It's a little easier to see. Here's Independence, 1776. So you know what? Why not sell this to Americans? And here's George Washington. And in this case, Liberty, here's the Liberty cap, is, sort of congratulating him. And this textile would have been seen in the elite homes of people in the United States, certainly Boston, Philadelphia, New York, and certainly Albany among very elite families like the Ten Broecks and von Rensselaers. Now, the maker of this particular embroidered piece is not at those elite levels, but there's 2 ways that she could have learned about images like this. The first is, being invited to tea at a very wealthy person's house, and they might have shown off, seen my new bedroom linens or my new draperies, and they would have admired this new print, this toile print form. Another way is through scraps of fabric. Expensive fabric like this would have been saved. Every little scrap would have been used, and a scrap of this type of fabric could easily have turned up in a pincushion or a needle holder. And as you can see, it's not a far leap from saying, I am not able to afford to buy this particular fabric, but how could I create it myself? And you could see how it lends itself to the embroidered line. So there's a pretty easy leap there. There's other cultural changes that are going on in the early United States that lead up to the creation of the embroidery that we're going to investigate today. And a major change is a change in both attitudes and change in location of burial places. So among European Americans in North America, the tradition for burials was 2-part. You either could have family burying places that were near your home, maybe 100 yards from the house or so. The family would be buried, there would be trees, it would be a quiet place to visit, was never disturbed, and you still see a few of these small family burial sites out in the countryside of Albany County. There's certainly some in Rensselaer County where the Schimmerhorns lived as well. But people who lived in cities, larger villages, and towns were buried in church graveyards, in the churchyards. Now, it seemed like a good idea, have people right near the church. So there's association, you're baptized there and then you're buried there. But as the colonial population grows in North America, they became very crowded. And by the 1790s, people were complaining that a visit to the churchyard, to the graveyard next to a church, was becoming a really unpleasant, if not horrific, experience. You would go to someone's interment, someone's burial, and your foot would slip through a rotted coffin that had not been properly buried. In some cases, they were burying people 4 deep in one grave. They were running out of room. So in 1796, New Haven, Connecticut was the first city to make the change to what was called the rural cemetery movement, moving cemeteries outside the city to large tracts of land. So it's really combining the idea of the rural cemetery, which was a large piece of land with a small burial, and the church cemetery, which is many people buried together. And it's kind of, if you will, taking the best of both approaches. So it's a large tract of land set aside. It's really the cemeteries as we know it today. And they were on the outskirts of town. And the idea was they're not going to be jammed full. They're going to be safe, walkable places. And they're also away from the water supply. That was an increasing concern as well in the late 18th century, early 19th century about having burials inside towns. So this is in New Haven, Connecticut. It was the rural cemetery, which is now known as the Grove Street Cemetery. And it has a wonderful entrance gate in the Egyptian revival style. And we'll talk a little bit more about Egypt and how it relates to this embroidered piece. Now, if you recall, in the embroidered piece, there is an obelisk, and it's a single item. And that's how we're used to seeing it in the United States today. The Washington Memorial. We see them anytime we drive by a cemetery. This has been adapted to a much smaller scale. Well, it's really appropriated from ancient Egyptian culture. And it has been appropriated for millennia. The first to appropriate Egyptian obelisks were the Romans, who saw and admired them, and in some cases took them back to Rome as a symbol of conquering Egypt, but also in a way admiring Egyptian culture. Now, we see them as single elements, but in ancient Egypt, obelisks were in pairs, and they weren't necessarily funerary in their association. They were sometimes near the pyramids, but they also would be marking either side of an entrance, say, to a temple. So they're really kind of out of context in the Roman tradition. They're moved to Rome or built in Rome. And then, of course, Europeans start the Grand Tour, especially in the 18th century onwards, and they too begin to appropriate Roman culture. So they either take these objects back to their country houses, say in England, or they build their own, sometimes out in the landscape, and they were called follies. So they're elements of the architecture that has nothing to do with the rest of the landscape, but it's sort of a sign of your cultural, the level of your cultural knowledge to have these objects out of context in your landscape. So in some ways, the obelisk also functions as an architectural folly in the embroidered picture that we're going to be investigating. And there's also a lot of emotion. This is a small brooch, just about a little over 1.5 inches high, that was commissioned by a mother who lost her 19-year-old daughter. And I'm going to make it a little larger so it's easier to see, because there's a lot going on in this image. So here is the mother who is in mourning, and she's the person who commissioned this small brooch. And here is the obelisk, which is the memorial, the gravestone to her daughter. But as you can see, her daughter has reappeared and shattered, broken the marble of the obelisk, and the two of them are reuniting. They're clasping their hands, not in sorrow, but in joy. And the daughter's eyes and the mother's are gazing upwards, heavenswards. So the idea in their belief system is that they would meet again in the afterlife. So when we look at these obelisks, and certainly if we drive by a cemetery today, an old-fashioned cemetery, we might see them as cold, as unfeeling, sort of plain marble or granite. But as this locket shows, they were filled with emotion, and particularly the emotion of women, is by Prudence Punderson. It was made in 1784, and it's called The First, Second, and Last Scene of Mortality, and it's in the Connecticut Historical Society's collections. And in it, Prudence reflects on all the stages of life shown at once, being an infant, and as you notice, cared for by an African-American woman, most likely enslaved. There's a scene of courtship on the wall, and there's Prudence herself, but she's sort of both a mother and she's reflecting on her own death. And sadly, Prudence herself died the following year after making this embroidered piece. So the idea of embroidery expressing these profound ideas is nothing new, but we do see this proliferation of mourning pictures in the era of the early Republic. To look more closely at the image itself, we really get the wonderful fine sense of how this was painted. So it was constructed by starting with a piece of silk, cream silk, which was toned with watercolors. And then this was hand painted in with some gouache. Pretty finely done. There is a tradition that it may have been done by Albany artist Ezra Ames, but it was most likely done by the young woman herself, Janette Van Wie, or whoever made this. And then you can see the stitching. There's some satin stitches. There's some straight stitches here, stem stitches, these wonderful built-up colors here, and chenille, silk chenille. So this was all done in silk, both with the flat floss silk, as you can see here and here, and then for more texture in the landscape, the chenille. And we know a couple of things from the embroidery techniques about the likely socioeconomic status of the woman who made this embroidery. The embroidery here is not done with a full satin stitch style. It's done in a very conservative way. So instead of stitching once, going over the fabric, going underneath, and coming up on the other side, so if you have 2 inches of stitching, you have 2 inches of thread underneath the cloth as well. It's done almost with a little back stitch. And what happens then is pretty much every inch of that expensive silk chenille is shown on the front of the piece. So that tells us that the person who made it does have money, but they don't have money to waste on hiding it on the back of the piece. So it's done in a very economical style. And also, if you look at the woman's sense of emotion, that's really the heart of this image. It's the woman's face and her gestures. There's a long tradition in Western European art of women showing deep emotion in mourning. This is a detail of a Northern European piece from about 1500, and it's Mary Magdalene in mourning at the tomb of Christ. So a woman showing strong emotion has a very long tradition in Western art. And North America at the time of early America is primarily a Protestant place, so they do not have this tradition, but nonetheless, they're referring to the earlier Catholic tradition of women showing strong emotion in religious art. Continuing on the theme of religion, the person in the paint in this embroidery is really showing her faith. Her eyes are glancing upwards and also towards this church. You can see it's 12:30. That may have significance. Perhaps it was the hour that the loved one passed away. And you can also get a wonderful sense of how the background of the silk was toned. So there's some blue in the sky. It's become slightly discolored down here. So they laid this out, toned it, and then would pencil in the outlines of the rest of the embroidery work. And you can see there's the angled stitching to give the sense of the build out of the shape of the tree. And then here you have a heavier stitch to really give build up to the tree form. If we look at this piece overall, we can see that the creation of it was very intentional. So as I mentioned, laying out the painting underneath, toning the entire piece, penciling in the outline, painting in gouache the woman's face, and then the stitching itself. The way it's constructed, we have a sense that it was likely put on a frame where the frame fit on this side of it, because if you notice, the stitching sort of stops abruptly here. So it's likely the young woman stitching it ran out of room, and then she moved her frame to the other side of the piece. You can see there's a little bit of a disconnect between the two sides. The other, if you notice, there's a slightly different skill level. Here it is very skillfully done with split stitching. There's a little bit of a curve to the stitching to give the sense of building up the landscape. And here it's almost like a flame stitch, very elaborate stitching work here. But this area is much cruder. It sort of ends abruptly. It doesn't have that sort of interwoven quality down here. So it's likely that this part was completed in an embroidery school, or perhaps while a governess was visiting, or a traveling embroidery teacher probably supervised this part. And this might have been the first part that someone started working on, or maybe it was part that they worked on when their teacher wasn't present. So there is some slight variations in the quality of the workwomanship, I should say. And then you can see there's clearly almost two sides of this. So it's probably the frame was moved over to accommodate it. The whole process of creating a piece like this meant that the young woman making it had to really step aside from daily work for a while, because to work in silk, any roughness on your hands, the silk would absolutely catch and fray and fall apart. So a young woman working on this had to keep her hands in perfect order, not just the nails, but the skin itself. And soaps in those days were quite harsh. If we washed our hands in them, our hands would become extraordinarily rough. And while the young woman who made this was not poor by any means, she wasn't that elite. So she would have helped out at home. She would have helped with laundry in some ways, maybe not the heaviest laundry, but to create a silk piece like this meant that she sort of had to abstain from those activities for a period of time while she worked on her embroidery. Maybe massaging her hands or oiling them or preparing them in some way, but you don't want oil on the threads, of course. But it wasn't everyday life that you could just jump from, doing chores at home in the garden, taking care of gardens and plants and washing, and then go in the evening to work on your embroidery. You had to almost create a separate space for yourself. It's similar to, say, someone raking a gravel path, which is a tradition in Japan. It's sort of the idea of working on a morning piece like this. You had to set aside your life. So that in itself was a testimony to both your diligence, but also to the fact that you were mourning the person who's memorialized here in this plinth, in this obelisk. There's a lot of symbolism in the piece. The weeping willow is a symbol we still have it with us today of mourning. Of course, the obelisk, as we discussed. There's the Greek urn affixed to the top, which is not an Egyptian feature, but it's a Greek feature affixed to the top of an Egyptian one. We associate these today with perhaps holding cremated ashes, but at the time it was a Greek symbol of plenty, a sacred symbol, sacred oils. So it's a very layered meaning. Of course, there's the ubiquitous flowers and the church revealing her religious devotion as well, and her belief that she would meet these loved ones again in the afterlife. So this piece is unique, and it's a work of art created by a young woman to express the emotions of the Republic. And as we look in upstate New York, we see people like Susan B. Anthony and Sojourner Truth, who use their vision, who use their voices to craft a new identity for the new Republic. And this tradition, of course, continues into the 21st century. People like Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Amanda Gorman, the poet who read at President Biden's inauguration. The idea of women expressing the tone, the views, and the values of a nation is something that really begins to emerge in the early Republic. And so as we celebrate Women's History Month, we invite you to consider how a young woman in Albany County in the early 19th century shared her emotions, shared her beliefs, and shared her family story for us to continue to be moved by today.